Welcome to another episode of Beautiful, Bad and Bizarre. Today we're here at Mortlake Crematorium to bring flowers and visit the final resting place of the wonderful star of the Carry On movies, Charles Hawtrey.
Oh, hello.
For a good number of years, the Carry On star Charles Hawtrey would allow people to assume that the highly acclaimed actor and theatre manager Sir Charles Hawtrey, who was born in 1858 and passed away in 1923, was his father. And in fact, he would not only avoid correcting it, he would delight in the assumption and positively encourage it. The truth is somewhat less glamorous. Our Charles was born on the 30th of November 1914 in Hounslow, London, to parents William John Hawtrey, who was listed on his son's baptism record as a mechanic, and mother Alice Crowe. Although his baptism record on October the 29th, 1916 shows that he was baptised George Frederick Charles, biographers and other sources show him to have been named George Frederick Joffre Hawtrey. Either way, we'll now be referring to George by his stage name, Charles or Charlie Hawtrey. Charles was a natural performer, and at the age of 8 he was appearing uncredited in the silent film called Tell Your Children with the American film actress Gertrude McCoy, which was released in 1922, and in 1923 he appeared in This Freedom, another silent film which again was an uncredited role. Aged 14, Charles was taken on by the drama teacher Italia Conti of the Italia Conti School of Drama. On learning how much the school fees were, Charles Hawtrey allegedly passed out. But the drama teacher saw this as a sign of his commitment to the profession and decided to delay payment until he was earning enough money. It was also Miss Conti who made the decision to change young George's name, choosing Charles Hawtrey. Interestingly, Italia Conti, when she was an actress, was asked by Sir Charles Hawtrey to teach children for the first production of Where the Rainbow Ends, which opened at the Savoy Theatre, London in 1911. During his teens, Charles not only performed in West End productions, but he also taught himself to play the piano and tap dance. He was also England's leading boy soprano at that time, with a record deal. By 1937, Charles Hawtrey was working opposite Vivien Leigh in the theatrical production of the comedy Bats in the Belfry. Charles played Jerry Morton, the brother of Vivien's character Jessica Morton. The reviews were wonderful, and 1937's Tatler magazine said, "Charles Hawtrey's dealings in adolescence are deft and at times delicious." Charles had made an additional 29 films by 1940. Although his parts are mostly uncredited, he was working with the likes of Errol Flynn and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Charles Hawtrey also regularly worked with Will Hay in films such as Where's That Fire, released in 1939, and a favourite of mine, The Ghosts of St Michael, released in 1941. Charles Hawtrey's quirky appearance being of a slight and delicate figure, despite the fact that he was well known for tucking in to rather excessive amounts of food in the studio canteens, helped immensely when auditioning for supporting and comedy roles. He was never shy about stripping down to the bare minimum and positively delighted in costume roles. But he was never going to achieve leading man status. However, Charlie appeared to be particularly happy when playing a woman, and apparently no one believed him when he said he enjoyed wearing a dress only because he had a case of boils on his bum, which were eased with the circulation of air. For some time, Charlie had also been playing a schoolboy, but as he aged, the parts were no longer available to him, although he did have a long-running radio role in Norman and Henry Bones, The Boy Detectives, a BBC Children's Hour production, portraying a schoolboy opposite Patricia Hayes. Both Charles and Patricia were in their 30s. This series aired from the early 1940s to the 1960s. If you haven't watched it already and would like to know more, I do have a video on Patricia Patricia Hayes, and I'll leave a link in the description of this video. There's little known about Charles Hawtrey's relationships at this time. In fact, at any time. It was something he kept very much to himself. This was an era when male same-sex relationships were not generally accepted, and there was always the possibility of being punished by a prison sentence. So the fact that he kept his relationships private is hardly surprising. And yet, conversely, through the years, Charles Hawtrey became well known for his outrageous and often lecherous comments and his desperate attempts at picking up men. In particular, he was rather partial to a sailor. It seemed that when Charlie was drunk, as he frequently was more and more throughout his life, all inhibitions flew out the window, but more about that later. In 1947, Charles Hawtrey declared that it was his ambition to appear in American films made in California. The author, Roger Lewis, Charlie's biographer, was to write that he envisaged himself as Charlie Chaplin or Stan Laurel. Sadly, it's unlikely that Charles Hawtrey ever made it to America even for a holiday. He certainly never had a career there. While it might seem on the face of things that Charles Hawtrey's career was a steady progression of success in supporting roles, and he also tried his hand at directing, it wasn't quite what it appeared to be, and Charles often found himself having to almost beg for work, and he was the recipient of an apparently endless string of rejection letters. Conversely, when Charles was working, he continuously attempted to achieve star billing, as in the case of working with Patricia Hayes. They were billed equally as Charles Hawtrey and Patricia Hayes. Charlie wanted the billing to be Charles Hawtrey with Patricia Hayes, threatening to withdraw if his demands were not met. It would be this attitude that would ultimately play a major part in ending the career of Charles Hawtrey, as we will discuss later in the video, giving real meaning to the cliche, "Pride cometh before a fall." It certainly didn't go in his favour on this occasion either, as the response was, "We regret that we are unable to accept Charles Hawtrey's proposed billing, so if he feels that he must withdraw from the cast of Norman and Henry Bones on that account, then we shall be very sorry to lose his services." And that, as they say, was the end of that. When Charles was cast in his first thriller in the West End, he was working with the lovely Joan Sims, and his mother Alice would accompany him on set. On this particular occasion, Alice was listening so intently to her son rehearse that a lit cigarette dropped from her lips into her handbag, where it began to smoulder. As Joan witnessed the event, she cried out, "Charlie, your mum's bag, it's on fire!" Charles, on hearing this, swiftly emptied his cup of tea into the bag. His mother snapped the bag shut, and Charles resumed his conversation. Charles Hawtrey had a close relationship with his mother Alice, and he would live with her in their cluttered and dusty home, full of eccentric Edwardian artefacts, such as an array of taxidermy, until her death in 1965, which would leave Charles completely distraught and bereft, and rapidly increasing his dependence on alcohol. Charles's father had previously passed away in 1952. Another Carry-On star, Liz Fraser, would also recall working with Charles, saying, "He was a curious little man who always had his mother with him at the studio." She continued, "He'd try to barricade her in his dressing room while he was working, but she would escape and run amok, throwing toilet rolls around the studio." Alice was suffering with dementia. In 1955, Charles Hawtrey appeared alongside Diana Dawes in the film As Long as They're Happy, playing a teddy boy, and he would work with Diana again on the 1979 film The Plank. Charles Hawtrey would also appear in another of my favourite comedy films, Passport to Pimlico, and was soon appearing in the ITV sitcom The Army Game. I haven't seen this, I must confess. Have you seen it? If you have, please let me know what you think of it, and if it's something I should catch up on. It was during the filming of The Army Game that Charles first worked with Bernard Bresslaw, later of Carry On fame, and by 1958 Charles Hawtrey would be cast in the first ever Carry On film, Carry On Sergeant. From there on in, including Carry On Sergeant, Charles Hawtrey would appear in no less than 23 Carry On films, and for many fans he was a much loved cast member, while in real life it was a somewhat different story, with several people declaring that Charles Hawtrey was thoroughly dislikable. Joan Sims would say that she had a particular soft spot for Charlie, recalling that he was an intensely proud man. However, Joan also stated that he was very lonely and very mixed up little man, but that the Carry On films would not have been the same without him.
Worry. I'll think of something to do with her.
Fellow Carry On star Barbara Windsor said that she found Charles Hawtrey the funniest actor on the Carry On team, but that he was incredibly unsociable, and that while waiting for the set to be ready, he would sit on his own away from the rest of the cast. Very aloof, smoking Waits, which were the cheapest cigarettes you could buy at the time, with a look of utter disdain on his face. Despite this, Barbara said that Charlie was her absolute favourite out of all the Carry On regulars. Charles had felt the same about Barbara, saying in an interview that his favourite people were Kenneth Williams and Barbara Windsor. Barbara took this as the greatest compliment, given Charles Hawtrey's reputation for being antisocial. One thing that Charles Hawtrey did participate in on set with his acting colleagues was playing poker between takes, although Liz Fraser said that Charles was a hopeless poker player and never won anything. He would always bring out his little purse of coins and take the whole thing very seriously. Joan Sims also remembered the poker games, saying that Charlie had a funny little habit of standing his cigarette on end on the table as he played his hand. Known for being a penny pincher, not only did Charles Hawtrey chain smoke cheap cigarettes, he drank the cheapest brand of gin, and early on in his career, before transport was provided by the studio, he would walk or take public transport rather than pay for a taxi, and when on a long journey by train, he'd take a loaf of bread, a packet of butter and a piece of cheese, and with a plastic knife he would make his own sandwiches rather than use the buffet car. When eating in the studio canteen, he distanced himself from the other cast members who had a reserved table, preferring to eat alone. Charlie's dearest companion, other than his mother, was, as Joan Sims recalled, his cat, to whom he would give booze-soaked sugar lumps and bread and butter doused with sherry. Joan Sims said that the cat was Charlie's greatest love, and that every day at Pinewood he'd nip off to the canteen to scrounge food for it. Others remembered that he had a turbulent relationship with the cat. He was known to spend a great deal of time having long drawn-out conversations with it, and on occasions heated arguments if he felt the cat was ignoring him, and Charlie's language could be rather uncharming. Goodness knows what the cat thought of that. Many people who worked with him would echo Liz Fraser's sentiments when she said, "I can't say I ever got to know Charles very well. He could be disturbingly rude and nasty, even to the people he professed to favour, and by the late 1960s his drinking had increased to the point where he would often arrive on set either drunk or with a hangover. And after a particularly heavy night of drinking, he would saunter into the studio with his chauffeur behind him, lugging a crate of R. White's lemonade. He was so dehydrated he would drink bottle after bottle."
I'm trying to give it up, but it's one of those nights. White's lemonade. I'm a secret lemonade drinker.
In 1968, Charles moved to 117 Middle Street, a 300-year-old cottage by the sea in Deal, on the Kent coast, and just as when he lived with his mother, the house was chaotic, with furniture stacked everywhere. He was notoriously eccentric, and, according to Joan Sims, Charles Hawtrey had a pervasive sadness that was not helped by his fondness for alcohol. By 1972, things were rapidly deteriorating for Charles, and Carry On Abroad would be the last in the series that would feature a cast of what could be considered the full team. It was shortly after his appearance in this film that Charles Hawtrey would fall out with the production team.
Oh, hello!
That same year, Charles had signed up for another Carry On Christmas special for Thames Television that would be shown on the 14th of December 1972. Hattie Jacques had been cast in various parts, including that of a fairy godmother. Sid James and Kenneth Williams were missing from the cast, and this led Charles to believe that he would receive top billing. However, the producers, Peter Rogers and Gerald Thomas, wanted Hattie Jacques' name to appear first. Hattie was finding great success working with Eric Sykes in the sitcom Sykes, and they felt her popularity would pull in more viewers. Hattie had received 11th billing in Carry On Abroad, while Charles was third after Sid and Kenneth, so naturally he assumed they weren't in a Carry On Christmas, he should get top billing. Just days before filming was to commence, Gerald Thomas spoke to Charles on the phone in an effort to persuade him to accept Hattie as top billing. He told Charles, "Well, this is it. You have to make up your mind finally right now. Before you hang up, will you accept second billing or won't you?" There was apparently a pause on the other end of the line. Then Charles Hawtrey told him, "No," and hung up. With that one decision, Charlie burned his bridges behind him. Barbara Windsor said, "He let Gerald Thomas down badly just 2 days before filming, and so he was never used again." Charles Hawtrey retired to Deal on a small pension, and Barbara Windsor said that when the Carry On TV compilations began, none of the cast received any royalties for them, and for Charlie it actually cost him money, as it brought in a new audience who would write to him at his home address for photos and autographs. Charles obliged and used his own money to pay for the photos and send them off, which is in stark contrast to the stories of him walking around Deal and being asked for his autograph. Charlie would respond to adults and children alike with a rude, spiteful and snappy F off, and on occasion tear up the paper that they'd handed him. The flamboyant side of Charles Hawtrey was in contrast to the grouchy stay-away-from-me character he would often present to the public when out and about. Kenneth Williams told Barbara Windsor that when Charlie retired to Deal, one weekend Kenny and some friends decided to visit Charlie, and they all went for a walk along the seafront. Charlie was wearing orange trousers, a blue shirt, and a bright silk scarf at his neck, and he was using his umbrella as a parasol. Kenneth Williams said, "Fishermen were eyeing us warily, and the rest of us were trying to look anonymous, but Charlie kept calling out, 'Hello, boys!' He turned to us proudly and said, 'They all adore me here, brings a bit of glamour into their dull lives.'" A few months before he died, one of Charlie's friends phoned Barbara Windsor, worried that Charlie was drunk all the time and was going down to the docks and waving at the sailors. When she asked what she could do, the friend said she could talk to Charlie, but Barbara felt that if Charlie wanted to live by the coast and smoke his weights and wave to sailors, then he should be allowed to do it. She said, "He may have been a bit of an oddball, Charlie, but he was a brave one." Joan Sims said they kept in close touch after Charles had retired, and that he would phone her regularly on a Sunday afternoon. The conversations would follow the same pattern. "Ah, hello, darling, ah." Joan would reply, "What are you up to, Charles?" Who would respond with, "Ah, darling girl, ah, And it would go on like that for about half an hour when Charles would suddenly hang up the phone. There are numerous reports of Charles Hawtrey being thoroughly disliked in Deal. He would go into local pubs, get completely wasted, insult everyone and refer to them as peasants. He was soon being barred from his favourite pubs. Taxi drivers would avoid having him as a fare. On the evening of the 6th of June 1981, Charles Hawtrey suffered a heart attack at his home and was rushed to hospital. He made a surprising recovery considering his lifestyle choices. 3 years later, on Sunday the 5th of August 1984, Charles Hawtrey made headline news when his cottage caught on fire. Allegedly, Charles had gone to bed with a 16-year-old boy, although I've seen various ages put forward, and left his cigarette burning in the lounge and the sofa caught fire. He was rescued from the blaze by firemen and was photographed looking very pale and shocked in his dressing gown without his toupee. The newspaper article described him as being once known as the most famous what's-his-name in British films. The author and Charles Hawtrey biographer Roger Lewis said that initially Charles dashed into the garden and raised the alarm before returning to the top story of the house so that a fireman would have to come and rescue him. Lewis also said that when he was rescued, the fireman asked him if he was all right, and Charles allegedly replied, "No, I'm not. My fags are upstairs by the bed and my boyfriend's in it." How true this is, I really wouldn't like to say. At the time, Charles Hawtrey told a reporter, "The smell of smoke woke me up and there were flames coming up the stairway," adding, "I've lost a lot of valuable antiques and sentimental keepsakes, but I'm all right. It was very frightening." Charlie refused hospital treatment for his burns, saying, "I regard myself as self-healing." Sadly, after this, he caught the attention of locals that rather enjoyed taunting Charlie as a vindictive sport, shouting abuse through his letterbox. Towards the end of his life, he became increasingly bitter about the carry-ons and appeared to regret spending his final 15 years in the profession being involved with them. He questioned why he never achieved the same level of success as Sid James, complained he'd been ostracised and that he'd got nothing from them, and was completely, shall we say, messed upon. He was later to say, "Getting drunk and dusting is all I do now." He became reclusive, still grieving for the mother who had devoted herself to him and who he worshipped. He felt lost without her, devoid of purpose, although he was still known to flirt shamelessly with young men in the local pubs and the students from the nearby Royal Marine School of Music. In September 1988, Charles Hawtrey collapsed in a drunken state as he tried to enter the Royal Hotel on the seafront near the pier, just around the corner from his home. He fell and shattered his femur and was taken by ambulance to the Buckland Hospital, Dover, his broken leg made worse by the problem that he already had with his arteries. As a result of years of smoking, Charles was suffering with peripheral vascular disease, and gangrene had set in, a serious condition where a loss of blood supply causes the body tissue to die. Charles Hawtrey was told by the doctor that he would need to amputate both of his legs, or else he would not survive. Barbara Windsor claimed upon hearing this, Charlie lit a cigarette and said, "No, I want to die with my boots on." There are stories of nursing staff asking Charlie for his autograph on his deathbed. In response, Charlie swore at them, and at one person, allegedly in particular, he threw a vase, which, to be fair, I don't blame him. On the 29th of September 1988, the hospital administrator, Mr. Tim Waite, told a newspaper that Charlie's condition was fair, adding that he had asked his patient if he could give out any information to the press, but that Charles Hawtrey had emphatically and angrily said no. About a month after refusing to have his legs amputated, Charles Hawtrey died at Winthorpe Lodge Nursing Home in Walmer, not far from his own home, on the 27th of October 1988 at 3:30 a.m. He was 73 years old. He had taken a great liking to a relative of the owner of the nursing home, a Mrs. Jackie Hyde, who would stay with Charlie in his last hours. His old friend Bernard Walsh, who had known Charlie for 30 years, said after his death, "Charles was a very secluded and self-contained person. He rejected a lot of people, but I'd known him for nearly 30 years and had kept in touch with him. He trusted me." Only 9 people attended Charles Hawtrey's funeral here at Mortlake Crematorium on the 31st of October 1988. Those people were neither family nor friends. Only Barbara Windsor and Frankie Howard sent cards and flowers. On the 5th of January 1989, Charles Hawtrey's estate was valued at £164,929. but he left no will. While it was without doubt that Charles Hawtrey had a talent for alienating people, he also had a talent for making people forget their worries and laugh out loud. He was simply fabulous on screen. He was quirky and bright, eccentric in the extreme, could be lewd to the point of obscene, and made many dubious choices. I can't say I would have enjoyed being at the sharp end of his personality, but one thing's for sure, the carry-ons would never have shined so brightly without Charles Hawtrey. And finally, I couldn't go to Mortlake without visiting one of my favourite actresses. Just before I left, I took some flowers to Carol White in the cemetery next door. If you haven't watched the video on Carol but would like to, you can find a link in the description of this video. Thank you so much for joining me here today to remember the life of the amazing, sometimes strange, sometimes peculiar, a little curious, but always entertaining Charles Hawtrey. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I really look forward to seeing you in the next one.